Flag Nag by Pauline Kael, published January 4th, 1982. When Arthur Penn goes wrong, he goes laboriously, painfully wrong, and the moments of talent that stick out are so jarring that they seem to make things even worse. Four Friends, his first film since The Missouri Breaks in 1976, is way out of tune and so miscalculated in its rhythms that some of us sit there squirming. The actors are dim, they're colorless and rather lost, but they don't come up with flamboyant howlers. They don't need to. Penn somehow manages to have them do relatively small things that are so off they erupt in your head. When the meant-to-be vibrant young heroine, Jodie Thalen, speaks up in her Tweety Bird voice and delivers a line such as, "I'm so tired of being young," the words carry a ball and chain of significance. When an aristocratic rotter, played by James Leo Hurley, arches an eyebrow, it's like a cannon going off. Four Friends was probably inspired by the Ettore Scola film We All Loved Each Other So Much, which opened here in 1977, and which is also about the friendship of three men and the woman each of them loves at some time, a friendship that, for Scola, spans post-war Italian social history, and for Penn spans the American social changes of the 60s. Scola, whose raffish, slapstick melancholy may in fact have been influenced by Penn's mingling of tones in the 1967 Bonnie and Clyde, takes his four characters from youth to middle age. Penn takes his from adolescence to maturity. The script is a semi-autobiographical account by Steve Tysick of the arrival in this country of a Yugoslavian working-class boy, Danilo, who comes with a big, heavy symbolic trunk. It seems to be full of solid values. The story of Danilo's growing to manhood in the America he loves is, although Tysick would probably disagree, deeply conservative. Danilo and the heroine may be opposed to the Vietnam War, and may take all the correct anti-establishment positions, but they're also always learning life's important lessons. An immigrant himself, Steve Tysick trumpets the values that each immigrant generation has trumpeted. There's a wholesome, beefy moralism in his writing which goes right back to the behavior of stalwart movie heroes of the past. And Arthur Penn, who in Bonnie and Clyde and Alice's Restaurant helped define the counterculture, and was even smug about it in Little Big Man, tries to make Tysick's vision express his own feelings. It's no wonder we writhe in our seats. Their two sensibilities don't mesh. In East Chicago, Indiana, in his last year of high school, Danilo, played by Craig Wasson, a steel worker's son, and his closest friend, a tall wasp Tom, played by Jim Metzler, and a short, pudgy Jewish boy, David, played by Michael Huddleston, are all, to varying degrees, in love with Jodie Thalen's Georgia. Whenever she's in Danilo's thoughts, he is the most smitten. The soundtrack apprises us of the fact by supplying Ray Charles singing Georgia on My Mind, a great version of a great song that does not deserve to be used so promiscuously, and as if the Georgia in the title meant no more than Irene or Sweet Sue. The film's Georgia is so naturally sensual that when she performs on her clarinet in the school orchestra, it's Dvorak's New World Symphony, she has to get up and wiggle her hips to the music. No high school orchestra that I've ever heard would arouse this much erotic intensity. Four Friends combines the worst of the Freudianism and self-pity of the William Ing Eliza Kazan Splendor in the Grass with the worst of the big immigrant theme of Kazan's America, America. Georgia, a would-be dancer who at 16 sees herself as an artist and a free spirit, and says that Isadora Duncan's soul is in her, loves Danilo, and wants to have her first sex experience with him. But Danilo, who writes poetry, is too frightened to leap at the chance, and she, offended, makes do with Tom. Danilo goes off to study at Northwestern, and David goes into his father's mortuary business. When, some 3 years later, Georgia becomes pregnant, and Tom, who isn't interested in marriage, goes off to war, she marries the obliging David. At the wedding, Danilo tells her she'll never dance, and he goes back to college, where he has acquired a chin beard like Solzhenitsyn's, and a rich, crippled roommate, Louis Carnahan, played by Reed Birney. In order to accommodate a whole catalog of symbolic events of the 60s, everything from a race riot to the landing on the moon, the plot bounces along exhaustingly. The enfeebled roommate, who's into astronomy, talks about stars colliding as if to embrace, and dreams of making it with a woman before he dies. When the restless Georgia becomes fed up with her middle-class existence, she takes off at Christmas time, leaving the baby behind with the ever-obliging David. She goes to Northwestern to see Danilo. He isn't there, he's back in East Chicago, asking her father's blessing for his coming marriage to Louis's sister Adrienne. But she sees the bedridden Louis, and sizing up the situation, she undresses and gives him a Christmas present. When Louis is put in the ambulance that will take him to the airport for a trip home, he's happily singing, "Georgia on my mind," on my mind. In Breaking Away, which Tysick also wrote, the director, Peter Yates, lightened Tysick's humor, but Penn, trying for a large-scale social vision, brings out its hearty bouquet. Louis and Adrienne's parents are played by James Leo Herlihy and Lois Smith, and a creepier, more decadent pair you've never seen. In the film's flossiest sequence, set on the Canahan estate on Long Island, the wedding celebration comes to a violent, tragic end, and the shocked Danilo goes to work driving a taxi in New York City. Meanwhile, Georgia has come to the city and become a hippie. Danilo finds her dancing barefoot in the street, in water from a fire hydrant. He tells her, "I wake up in the morning loving you. I go through the day loving you. I go to sleep loving you." But she says, "Not now, I don't know." So Danilo goes back to the steel mills, dragging his trunk and searching for his honest roots. And pretty soon we get cross-cutting between Danilo in a full beard folk dancing in the sunshine with his immigrant worker friends, and Georgia and her soul-sick druggy hippie pals at a strobe-lighted psychedelic revel that features acid and a suicide in flames. It's health versus sickness, life versus death, and the movie carefully spells out which side it's on. Although Danilo is against the Vietnam War, when he sees a flag being burned at a Don't Fight in Vietnam rally, he's upset. Danilo Tysick believes in a proper respect. Four Friends views the American 60s as a sturdy burgher from Central Europe might. These kids don't appreciate their freedom. They have a lot of growing up to do. There's something disgusting in the obviousness of the stern, old-world steelworker father who doesn't want his son to go to college, and the careworn mother who's always slaving over a hot stove. I haven't seen a mother this old and careworn in an American movie in decades. What is she doing, huddled over in misery all the time? She has only one son and one husband. How much agony can the cooking be? And there's Georgia, who has to learn her lesson, to accept the responsibility of being a mother, and has to mature enough to appreciate the vitality that Danilo represents. At the end, Danilo prepares for his new life. He makes a ritual of burning his symbolic trunk, and he and Georgia and her child stand firmly facing the future, along with Tom, who has acquired an Oriental wife and her 2 children, and David, who has also found himself the right woman. This foursquare optimism is much harder to take than cynicism or disillusion, because we're supposed to learn from it, and what we're supposed to learn is how lucky we are to be Americans. We'd have to be terrible fools not to know that, and we'd have to be moral idiots not to be disturbed by what is entailed in our good fortune. There's a flag-waving underlayer to this picture's love affair with America, the melting pot. Tysick is the screenwriter as national cheerleader. When the 3 high school boys are out in the streets, playing woodwind and horns and serenading Georgia, they're like the spirit of '76. At the end, when Danilo tells his hard-working father, played by Miklos Simon, that he has never seen him smile, the father chuckles and tries to oblige. He has to screw up his face to do it, and it's a cockeyed grin. I think it may be the only genuinely funny thing in the movie, and it seems to be there as an iconic seal of confidence in the future. Mostly, we get detestable fake epiphanies. When Danilo has been shot, not fatally, and is in the hospital, his father mutters America. He's saying to his son, "That's what happens when you run around with Americans," as if Danilo's getting hurt were proof of some kind of national degeneracy. And then we hear the Star-Spangled Banner, faintly, ironically. Who is it who's making this comment? Is it actually Arthur Penn? Is he backing up the father's fatuousness? This love-hate confusion inflates the importance of the film. It's all one great big ambivalent message. Doesn't Penn understand that in Bonnie and Clyde he intuitively celebrated the country, and that when he sets out to do it consciously here, he merely falsifies it? Lois Smith has a peerless example of the indefinably sad, indefinably symbolic Lois Smith scene, in which she says, "The excess of all this is a little staggering." Then she lets out a yelping sound that's like the grand mommy of a scream. Arthur Penn shouldn't let anyone in this movie use the word excess. An immense amount of skill and planning must have gone into making My Dinner with Andre, which is like a mad tea party or a mad modern platonic dialogue about the meaning of life. It flows smoothly and easily, creating the illusion that we are simply listening in on the dinner-time conversation of the playwright Wallace Shawn and the former avant-garde theater director Andre Gregory. But it has a beautiful structure, and the 2 men have turned themselves into perfect foils. The premise of the movie is that they haven't seen each other since 1975, when Andre, after directing a play of Wally's at the Public Theater, dropped out, took off on a spiritual quest for reality, which led him around the world. Actually, they taped their conversations 2 or 3 times a week for 3 months, and then Shawn worked for a year shaping the material into a script. Though they're playing comic distillations of aspects of themselves, they had to learn their lines and rehearse with the director, Louis Malle. Wally persuades Andre to tell him what he has been up to, and the thin, ascetic, hawk-like Andre, who's like the sum of all the crackpot, glittery-eyed charmers in the world, pours out the record of his preternatural experiences. He just keeps going, in wave after impassioned wave, describing astonishing, preposterous adventures in the Polish forests, where he worked with Jerry Grotowski's students, and during a group trance discovered he could hold his hand in a flame, in India and Tibet, and in the Sahara, where he and a Buddhist ate sand, in the fin-horned colony in Scotland, where he talked to plants and made them grow, and even in Montauk, where he was buried alive in a death and rebirth ceremony. Andre is the kind of person who becomes ecstatically involved in every system of ideas that isn't grounded in anything, and who is at the site of every imaginary volcano. Wally, the imp, gets a glazed expression and has a rough time keeping his eyes open. When he's more alert, his face registers total incomprehension and disbelief. And when Andre says that reading The Little Prince made him weep, Wally squints, stupefied. He throws in an occasional skeptical dart, and then, when he begins to talk, he plays warthog to Andre's soaring flights of mysticism. He claims that he feels no need for anything more than the satisfactions of the everyday, and he offers the grubbiest of small comforts as proof of the fullness of his life. We see Andre from Wally's point of view, and we're put in the position of feeling, as Wally does, that Andre is talking ethereal gibberish. But there's a suave, hypnotic urgency in the theatricality of Andre's diction and manner, in the rapidity of his speech, even in the movement of his pointed long jaw. It's a bit reminiscent of John Carradine's. He's an aging man of the theater, all profile, and with handsome, long, flat ears and long fingers that are constantly in motion, accompanying his words. He still has a full head of hair. The much younger Wally is wide-faced and bald. Andre's outpourings are those of the men and women of the theater who became dissatisfied with the limits of stage performance and began to delve into para-theatrical cults. What Andre acts out for us is the questing that has torn so much of the modern theater apart. And though he says that he feels he has squandered his life, you get the impression that he's still ready to take up the journey and head for the newest, most exotic hallucination. Wally, the pragmatist and sensualist, may stand for our common sense and our comforts, but Andre, with his cadenced mumbo-jumbo and his love of being outrageous, and the bemused, faraway gleam in his eyes, is the star and the hero. He's the more deeply funny of the two, and no doubt Wallace Shawn planned it that way. It's an amazing performance that Andre Gregory puts on, and we could not have the illusion of simply listening to a man pouring out the story of a willed and thoroughly enjoyed madness if Louis Malle didn't have the art to be self-effacing. Possibly, Shawn didn't need to turn himself into a Sancho Panza cartoon. He might have made a stronger case for the richness of everyday life. But his theatrical instinct was probably sound. He plays the earthy clown to Andre's fool of God. This is a bizarre and surprisingly entertaining satirical comedy, the story of the search beyond theater turned into theater, or at least into a movie. If movies were given grades for neatness, Absence of Malice would go to the head of the class. This trim, well-paced newspaper melodrama is remarkably lucid and easy to follow. A federal strike force in Miami investigating the disappearance and presumed murder of a union leader decides to stir things up by putting pressure on Michael Gallagher, played by Paul Newman, an honest small-scale liquor wholesaler whose dead father was a mafia leader and whose uncle is now the top man in the organization. The thinking of the federal agents is that the uncle either ordered the disappearance or knows who did, and that if Gallagher is put in enough of a bind, he will find out what they want to know in order to clear himself. And so the head of the strike force, played by Bob Balaban, arranges to leak the false information that Gallagher is being investigated for involvement in the union leader's disappearance. Megan Carter, played by Sally Field, is the eager beaver reporter who snaps up the story and spreads it on the front page. The Longshoremen's Union immediately refuses to let its men handle Gallagher's goods, and his business is shut down. The movie tells the story of how Gallagher turns the methods of the authorities and the newspaper woman against them. Paul Newman is leaner than ever, and by contrast with his body, his large silvery head has become more imposing. He is majestic without losing his cockiness. In absence of malice, as in Slapshot and Fort Apache, The Bronx, he seems to have transcended age. This may be because all his senses are quickened by the desire to act. There's nothing stale or brackish about Paul Newman's acting these days. It's bilge-free. The role of Gallagher needs a strong star face, because the character's emotions aren't written. Newman takes this parched construct, an intelligent, decent, and loyal man, and invigorates it by his swift movements. Gallagher is a man of few words. The script is rather frugal. Newman suggests a man who has lived by himself for so long that he has lost the habit of small talk, and his angry reserve gives the role some depth. Newman's Gallagher isn't someone you'd want to cross. This is a sly, compact performance, and in the one scene where Gallagher blows up, throws Megan on the floor, and hisses his rage right into her ear, Newman shows that his emotional force is stronger than ever, more concentrated. Newman hasn't turned himself into a mini-industry. He's a canny actor, and when he gets a real scene, in Fort Apache, walking the dead nurse and trying to bring her back to life, or here his explosion at the reporter's callousness, which has caused the suicide of Gallagher's close friend Teresa, an achingly helpless, frightened woman, played by Melinda Dillon. He has the freshness in him to reach for and to achieve emotions that he has never attempted before, not on the screen at least. The directing by Sidney Pollack is controlled and efficient. He does a tight and tidy job. But there's a problem with the conception of Megan. The plot requires that she be basically insensitive and shallow, and she seems to be the kind of careerist who rises in the world because of her convenient, dumb ruthlessness. And Sally Field's Megan, with her puckered, disappointed face, is the right type. Yet the movie also wants to cook up a bittersweet romance between Megan and Gallagher, so it softens her, and Sally Field tries to be appealing, and the film loses its assured tone in her scenes. It also isn't clear whether Gallagher is genuinely attracted to her, or is manipulating her. The director may have been afraid of making him a son of a bitch. Megan's pathetic grapplings with journalistic ethics, with conscience and responsibility, might have had a satirical edge, but Pollack directs them as though they were serious and honest. If I hadn't seen Sally Field's work in the two-part TV movie Sybil, I would think from her performance here that she was a puny actress with no range. Having seen what she can do, I assume that there's courage in her staying with Megan's small soul and her tired expression and little girl voice. But there's something off in the performance. Sally Field is skillful here, but she isn't interesting. Paul Newman can't help diminishing her. He gives you the feeling of a man thinking. You can see from the glint in his eyes that there's something going on, and she has nothing under the tacky surface. The writing doesn't help. The script, by Lester Lutke, a former newspaperman, is crisply plotted, but he doesn't write scenes to reveal anything more in the characters than the plot requires. The film's neatness is a limitation, not a virtue. It's moderately entertaining, but it leaves no residue, except for Melinda Dillon's scenes, which violate the film's tidy functionalism and momentarily give it a crazy humanity. Melinda Dillon takes us so far inside Teresa that she has no protective covering. She's transparent, and we understand perfectly why Gallagher cherishes his long friendship with her. Teresa's scene at dawn, when a newsboy delivers the papers carrying the story that Megan has written about her, and she does a leaping little walk from one patch of lawn to the next, gathering the papers so her neighbors won't read it, has a touch of wobbly poetic terror. Melinda Dillon's work here, and in Slapshot, and in the early part of FIST, adds up to something marvelously inventive. She may be that rarest of critters, an actress who thinks out completely new characters. The opposite of her kind of acting is Bob Balaban's performance. He must think that he's doing Captain Queeg. He has devised an attention-getting nervous shtick. He spins his hands around while playing with rubber bands, and he never gives it a rest. Those rubber bands are the only character he's got. He carries functionalism so far that his acting is a joke. But the other minor roles are played with a high degree of professionalism and personality. Pollock likes actors. There's a scene or two in which attention is focused in turn on Barry Primus, Luther Adler, Joseph Summer, Wilfred Brimley, Don Hood, and John Harkins. Part of what makes Absence of Malice so much like a smart, modest melodrama of the 30s and 40s is Pollock's use of those performers as character types. It's like the Warner's stock company. The whole picture is in the American movie tradition of entertaining muckraking. In order to give the plot symmetry, Gallagher takes a sweet revenge that is morally questionable, and is also not available to most people whose names are dirtied in the press. And I doubt that people who are out to get even are as calm and well-balanced as Newman's Gallagher. He gives revenge class, so that we can all enjoy it. It's the fantasy of getting even that people whose names never appear in the papers could still share in when Carol Burnett won her libel suit against the National Enquirer. There have been indignant mutterings that this film represents an attack on the press. Actually, it represents a fairly straightforward querying of journalistic practices, and why not? It may be that some members of the press just don't like to see one of their own treated as a pain. The only thing that's the matter with this material, as a movie subject, is that, with the exception of Newman's intensity and Dillon's scenes, and a few of the character bits, you could get it all by reading an article. It might easily be an essay question test in ethics, and in fact will probably be used that way in journalism courses. And very likely the students trying to puzzle out whether Megan is doing anything morally wrong will think in the same abstract terms that she uses, and will forget the words that Gallagher, bewildered by what she has done to Teresa, says to her. Couldn't you see what it was to her? Couldn't you stop scribbling for a second and just put down your goddamn ballpoint pen? Didn't you see her? Thank you for listening. Please comment and like and subscribe and all that stuff. And here's me making mistakes. But they don't come up with flamboyant doops. A friendship that, for Scola, spars post-war spars? Louis and Adrian's parents are played by James Leo Herlihy and Lois Smith, and a creepier, more dead... Herlihy and Lois Smith, and a There's something disgusting in the obviousness of the old, stern... In order to give the plot symmetry, Gallagher takes a sweet revenge that is